In May 1945, Soviet General Dmitry Volkov walked into the Thuringian forest and was never seen again. For 80 years, his disappearance remained one of World War II's strangest unsolved mysteries. Then, a forestry drone mapping root systems for a conservation project captured thermal signatures that didn't make sense. What investigators found buried beneath decades of soil and vegetation would not only solve the general's vanishing, but reveal a secret so carefully guarded that it had outlived the entire Soviet Union. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was in ruins. Across the continent, soldiers celebrated, wept, and tried to process the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. But in the dense forests of Thuringia, in what would soon become East Germany, General Dmitry Volkov had other plans. Volkov wasn't just any Soviet officer. At 43, he'd risen through the ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and political savvy. He'd survived Stalin's purges, commanded divisions at Stalingrad, and earned decorations that covered half his chest. His colleagues described him as calculating, intensely private, and unnervingly composed under pressure. On the morning of May 9th, Volkov's aide reported him missing. His bed in the commandeered manor house hadn't been slept in. His uniform hung neatly in the wardrobe. His sidearm remained in its holster on the desk. The only things missing were the clothes he'd worn the previous evening and a leather satchel he carried everywhere. The initial search focused on obvious possibilities. Desertion seemed unlikely for a decorated general, but the war had broken stronger men. Kidnapping by Nazi remnants? The forest still harbored scattered resistance fighters. Defection to the west? The Americans were only 30 kilometers away, and the Cold War's first frost was already settling in. Soviet military police combed the forest for 3 weeks. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of struggle, no witness who'd seen anything unusual. It was as if the general had simply dissolved into the morning mist. What made the disappearance particularly strange was timing. Volkov had everything to gain by staying. He was positioned for a hero's return to Moscow, likely a promotion, possibly a political appointment in the new Soviet satellite government. Men in his position didn't vanish on the eve of victory. His wife, Katerina, was brought from Moscow for questioning. She seemed genuinely bewildered. Dmitry loved his country, she insisted. He wouldn't abandon his duty. But investigators noted she used past tense when speaking of her husband, as if she'd already accepted he was gone. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, took over the investigation in June. Their methods were less gentle than the military police. They interrogated everyone who'd had contact with Volkov in his final weeks: subordinates, fellow officers, even the German civilians who'd served meals in the manor house. One detail emerged that seemed significant. 3 days before his disappearance, Volkov had requisitioned a military truck and driver for what he called reconnaissance of secured territory. The driver, Private Yuri Sokolov, reported they'd driven deep into the forest, stopped at what seemed like a random location, and the general had walked into the trees carrying surveying equipment. He'd returned 2 hours later covered in dirt, saying nothing about what he'd been doing. The NKVD brought Sokolov back to the location. He couldn't find the exact spot. The forest all looked the same, he said. Thousands of trees, endless undergrowth. They searched the area anyway, found nothing, and eventually concluded the general had been surveying defensive positions, standard military practice, even in secured territory. By August, the official conclusion was filed. General Dmitry Volkov had likely been killed by Nazi holdouts, his body hidden or destroyed. A state funeral was held in Moscow with an empty casket. Katerina received his medals and a widow's pension. His name was added to monuments honoring the war's heroes, but some people never stopped wondering. Volkov's brother Alexei, a professor of engineering in Leningrad, refused to accept the official story. He spent years writing letters to military officials, demanding the investigation be reopened. His persistence earned him unwanted attention from the secret police. In 1952, he was arrested on fabricated charges of anti-Soviet activity and sent to a labor camp where he died 3 years later. The decades passed. The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, then gradually weakened, then collapsed entirely. The Thuringian Forest, once part of the militarized border between East and West Germany, became a peaceful nature reserve. Hikers walked trails where soldiers had once patrolled. The war faded into history books and elderly memories. General Volkov's disappearance became a footnote, occasionally mentioned in histories of unsolved wartime mysteries. A few conspiracy theories circulated. Some claimed he'd defected and lived out his days under an assumed name in America. Others suggested he'd been executed by Stalin for unknown political reasons, the Forest story a cover-up most people forgot entirely. Until Dr. Helena Richter launched her drone. March 2025. Dr. Richter, a forestry ecologist at Jena University, was leading a research project mapping tree root systems across the Thuringian Forest. The data would help predict which areas were most vulnerable to the severe storms that had been increasing in frequency. Her team used specialized drones equipped with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, technology that could see beneath the forest floor. On March 14th, flying a grid pattern over a particularly remote section of forest, one of her drones detected something unusual. The thermal imaging showed a heat signature that didn't match natural geological formations. It was geometric, clearly artificial, about 8 meters below the surface. At first, Richter assumed it was wartime debris. The forest was full of it: unexploded ordnance, collapsed bunkers, buried equipment. The area had seen heavy fighting in 1945. She marked the location and continued her survey. But the signature nagged at her. Most buried metal cooled to match the surrounding soil temperature within decades. This signature suggested something different. Either the object was massive enough to retain heat differently, or something about the structure was allowing thermal transfer in an unusual pattern. She brought the drone back 2 days later for a more detailed scan. The ground-penetrating radar revealed a structure roughly 12 meters long, 6 meters wide, constructed of reinforced concrete. It was deep, deliberately hidden, and based on the decay patterns, approximately 80 years old. Richter contacted the local historical preservation office. Germany took unexploded ordnance seriously, and any wartime structure needed to be assessed by experts before excavation. The Preservation Office sent the data to the Federal Office for Military History. That's when things got interesting. The military historians recognized the construction pattern immediately. It matched Soviet military engineering specifications from 1945, specifically the type of emergency command bunkers built for high-ranking officers in occupied territories. But according to all existing records, no such bunker had ever been constructed in this location. Within a week, a joint team had assembled. German military historians, structural engineers, and a representative from the Russian government, who'd taken sudden interest when informed a Soviet general's name, had come up in connection with the site. The Russian official was notably tight-lipped about why Moscow cared about an 80-year-old bunker. The excavation began on April 2, 2025. The team worked carefully, mindful that the structure might be unstable or booby-trapped. What they found in the first 3 days of digging was unremarkable. Layers of soil, root systems, the normal composition of forest floor that had accumulated over 8 decades. Then, on day 4, they hit concrete. The entrance had been carefully concealed and sealed. Not hastily, not as if someone had been trying to escape pursuit, but methodically, as if someone had wanted to ensure the bunker stayed hidden and intact. The concrete plug sealing the entrance was 1/2 meter thick, reinforced with steel rebar in a pattern that suggested whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing. It took 2 more days to cut through the seal safely. The team worked in shifts, using diamond-tipped saws and careful controlled demolition. Finally, on April 8th, they broke through. The air that rushed out was stale, but not toxic. The bunker had been sealed well enough to prevent water infiltration, but not perfectly airtight. Structural engineers examined the entrance carefully before allowing anyone inside. Dr. Richter wasn't part of the entry team, but she watched the live feed from the cameras mounted on the first explorer's helmet. What she saw made her forget entirely about tree root systems. The bunker's interior was pristine. No water damage, no collapse, no decay beyond what 80 years of sealed darkness would naturally cause. The entry corridor led to a main chamber, and in that chamber, perfectly preserved by the cool, dry conditions, was a workspace that looked like its occupant had stepped out yesterday. A desk, a chair, shelves lined with books, a camp bed in the corner, neatly made, maps on the walls, some marked with notations in Cyrillic script. And, on the desk, in the beam of the camera's light, a leather satchel. The team leader's voice came through the radio feed. "We need to get the Russian representative down here. Now." Because spread across the desk, weighted down by a pistol that hadn't been fired, were documents bearing the seal of the Soviet High Command. And in the leather satchel, perfectly preserved, was General Dmitry Volkov's identification papers. The general hadn't been killed by Nazi holdouts. He hadn't defected. He hadn't been executed by Stalin's secret police. He'd vanished into this bunker deliberately, and what the team was about to discover in the sealed chamber beyond the main room would finally explain why. The sealed chamber beyond the main room was discovered purely by accident. One of the structural engineers, checking for wall stability, noticed an acoustic anomaly. When he tapped the eastern wall of the bunker, the sound echoed differently, hollow. It took another day to locate the hidden mechanism. The door was ingeniously concealed, its edges flush with the concrete wall, painted to match perfectly. Only when they found the pressure plate hidden beneath a loose floorboard did the entrance reveal itself, sliding open with a pneumatic hiss that suggested mechanisms still functional after 80 years. The Russian representative, a man named Alexei Petrov, who'd identified himself only as a historical consultant, insisted on entering first. "Doctor." Richter noticed his hand trembled slightly as he stepped through the doorway. Whatever Moscow had sent him to find, he seemed genuinely uncertain whether he wanted to discover it. The sealed room was smaller than the main chamber, perhaps 3 meters by 4. But its contents were staggering. Filing cabinets lined 2 walls, each drawer meticulously labeled in Russian. A second desk held what appeared to be scientific equipment: microscopes, measurement tools, collection jars containing samples of something organic that had long since decomposed into unrecognizable material, and photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned to boards, spread across surfaces, filed in folders. Photographs of the forest, but not ordinary nature documentation. Each image showed trees marked with paint, numbered, cataloged, close-ups of bark patterns that looked almost like writing, root systems excavated and measured, and something else, something that made the team exchange uncomfortable glances. In several photographs, human figures stood beside the trees for scale. But these weren't German soldiers or Soviet troops. They were civilians, and they were clearly prisoners. Gaunt faces, striped uniforms, the unmistakable signs of concentration camp inmates. Dr. Richter felt her stomach tighten. Whatever General Volkov had been doing in this forest, it involved people who had no choice but to participate. Petrov moved to the filing cabinets with the air of someone who'd been preparing for this moment. He opened the first drawer, withdrew a folder, and began reading. His face, already pale, went ashen. "What is it?" Dr. Richter asked. Petrov didn't answer immediately. He closed the folder, opened another, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Project Meridian. I thought it was legend, a story told by old KGB men who drank too much, but it was real." The documents Petrov examined revealed a Soviet research initiative that had begun in late 1944, just as the Red Army was pushing into German-held territory. The project's stated goal was to investigate reported anomalies in certain forest regions of Eastern Europe, anomalies that German scientists had allegedly been studying since the mid-1930s. General Volkov hadn't been assigned to standard military operations. He'd been handpicked by Stalin himself to locate and secure whatever research the Germans had compiled, and according to the documents, he'd found it. The files described something the German researchers called temporal echo zones, areas where the boundary between past and present appeared permeable, where trees grew in patterns that defied normal botanical behavior, where Soviet instruments detected electromagnetic readings that shouldn't exist in nature. One report, dated March 1945 and written in Volkov's own hand, described an experiment. A clock placed at the base of one particular oak tree ran 7 minutes slower than an identical clock placed 20 meters away. When the clocks were switched, the effect reversed. The tree itself seemed to be affecting time. Dr. Richter read the report 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding, but the documentation was meticulous. Measurements, controls, repeated trials. Either General Volkov had been conducting genuine scientific research into something extraordinary, or he'd descended into complete delusion. The photographs suggested the former. Among the images were time-lapse sequences showing individual trees over periods of weeks. In normal conditions, trees in early spring would show gradual budding, predictable growth patterns. These trees budded, grew leaves, and shed them in cycles that didn't match the calendar. One oak appeared to experience autumn in April, spring in July, winter in September. The Germans knew, Petrov said, still rifling through documents. They'd been studying this forest for years. They built a research station here in 1937, disguised as a timber survey operation. When the Soviets advanced, the German scientists destroyed their facilities and fled, but they left enough behind for Volkov to understand what they'd discovered. A leather journal, smaller than the others, sat on the scientific desk. Dr. Richter opened it carefully. The pages were covered in Volkov's handwriting, but this wasn't official documentation. This was personal. A diary. The entries began in February 1945, just after Volkov arrived in the region. February 18. Established base camp. Local population reports strange occurrences in the forest. Missing time, sounds that don't match visible sources. I am skeptical, but orders are clear. Investigate thoroughly. March 3. Found the first marked tree today. German notation still visible. When I touched the bark, I felt something, difficult to describe, like static electricity, but deeper. My watch stopped for 17 seconds. March 29. We've identified 47 trees exhibiting anomalous properties. The pattern they form is too precise to be natural. Someone, or something, arranged these trees deliberately, but the growth rings suggest they're centuries old. The contradiction is maddening. April 15. Repeated the German experiments with concentration camp laborers. I am not proud of this decision, but I must know. Sent 3 subjects into the marked zone at dawn. They emerged at what their watches indicated was noon, but only 20 minutes had passed by our clocks. The subjects were disoriented, aged. One died within hours. I have documented everything, but I fear what it means. Dr. Richter's hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries grew increasingly erratic. May 2. Moscow demands results I cannot provide. How do I explain that time itself bends in this forest? That I've measured it, documented it, witnessed it, and still cannot comprehend it? They will think me mad. May 20. The trees are growing faster now. The pattern is expanding. I've calculated the progression. If it continues at this rate, the entire forest will be affected within 3 years. And then what? Will the anomaly spread beyond the forest? Will it consume the region? The country? June 7. I have made a decision that will cost me everything. I cannot allow this knowledge to reach Moscow. Stalin would weaponize it. He would sacrifice thousands to understand it, to control it. I've seen what happens to people exposed to the temporal fields. The degradation, the madness. I cannot be responsible for that horror. June 30. I have destroyed all communications equipment. Told my staff the radio was damaged by German saboteurs. They suspect nothing. I've been preparing this bunker for weeks, moving supplies in secret. When the time comes, I will disappear. They will assume I was killed. It's better than the alternative. The final entry was dated the 15th of July, 1945. This is my last notation before I seal the bunker completely. I've sent my remaining staff away on a fabricated mission. By the time they realize I'm gone, it will be too late to find me. I'm leaving all documentation here, hidden but preserved. Perhaps someday, when humanity is wiser, when we've learned to use knowledge responsibly rather than as a weapon, someone will find this place and understand what I've discovered. Until then, I remain here, a guardian of secrets too dangerous to share. If you're reading this, I'm long dead. The forest remains. Be careful, it's watching. It's always watching. Dr. Richter set down the journal, her mind reeling. Petrov had gone silent, staring at nothing. Did he stay here? One of the engineers asked. Did Volkov just live in this bunker until he died? Petrov shook his head slowly. We need to search the entire structure. Now. They found the third chamber 10 minutes later. Another hidden door, another sealed room, smaller than the others. And inside, lying on a simple cot, wearing a Soviet general's uniform that had somehow remained intact, were the skeletal remains of Dmitry Volkov. On the floor beside the cot was a pistol, loaded, unfired. Volkov hadn't died of starvation or old age or suicide. The medical examiner, brought in 2 days later, would confirm what everyone suspected the moment they saw the body. Based on bone density, teeth, and other forensic markers, General Dmitry Volkov had been approximately 90 years old when he died. He'd vanished in 1945 at age 42. He died sometime in the late 1990s, based on decay patterns and environmental factors. He'd lived in that bunker for over 50 years. The bunker became Dr. Richter's obsession. She spent 3 days cataloging every document, every measurement, every horrifying detail Volkov had recorded. The research team worked in shifts, none of them wanting to stay underground longer than necessary. Something about the space felt wrong, like the air itself remembered what had happened there. Volkov's living arrangements told their own disturbing story. Empty ration containers meticulously stacked. Water collection systems that channeled groundwater through crude filtration. A calendar scratched into the concrete wall, marking days that became months, that became years. He'd survived down here through sheer willpower and preparation. But survival wasn't the mystery that kept Richter awake at night. The mystery was why he'd needed to survive for 50 years when he should have died of old age decades earlier. Petrov discovered the answer in Volkov's medical logs. The general had documented everything about his physical condition with scientific precision. Monthly measurements, blood pressure readings taken with antiquated equipment, detailed observations about his aging process, or rather, the lack of it. Look at this progression, Petrov said, spreading the journals across the bunker's metal table. 1,945, age 42. Standard health markers. 1,950, age 47. Still normal. Then 1,955. Richter leaned closer. Volkov's handwriting had grown shaky by then, but his observations remained precise. I've aged perhaps 2 years in the past decade. My hair grays slowly. My joints pain me less than they should. I am 52 chronologically, but my body suggests I'm barely 50. The entries continued. 1,960, 1,970, 1,980. Each decade showing the same impossible pattern. Volkov was aging, but at roughly 1/5 the normal rate. The temporal field, Richter whispered. He was living inside a temporal anomaly. Time was passing differently for him than it was above ground. One of the graduate students, a physics major named Alexei, spoke up. But that doesn't make sense. If time was slower here, we'd measure it. Our instruments would detect the differential. Richter shook her head. Check Volkov's calculations again. He wasn't experiencing uniform time dilation. The effect was biological, not environmental. The field wasn't slowing time itself. It was slowing aging. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Volkov hadn't just discovered a temporal anomaly. He'd discovered something that affected cellular degradation, metabolic processes, the fundamental mechanisms of human aging. Stalin would have built a factory here. He would have brought his entire military apparatus to this forest and demanded they replicate the effect, weaponize it, control it. Thousands would have died in the experiments. Volkov had understood this, so he'd chosen to disappear rather than hand humanity a power it wasn't ready to wield responsibly. Dr. Richter found the final piece of the puzzle on the fourth day. Hidden behind a loose panel in Volkov's sleeping chamber was a leather satchel containing personal items, photographs of a woman and 2 children. Letters, never sent, addressed to someone named Elena. And a smaller journal, this one not scientific but deeply personal. The entries were sporadic, written during moments of weakness or profound loneliness. They painted a picture of a man slowly losing his mind in isolation while desperately clinging to his principles. 1962. I think about Elena constantly now. She would be 53. The children, grown with families of their own. Do they remember me? Do they hate me for abandoning them? I tell myself this sacrifice was necessary, but the loneliness is a physical thing crushing me. 1978. Sometimes I hear voices in the forest, whispers that sound like Russian but make no sense. I know it's my mind fracturing, but the isolation is unbearable. I've been here 33 years. I should be 75 years old. My body tells me I'm barely 60. 1991. The Soviet Union has fallen. I heard it on a radio I salvaged from old equipment, modified to receive signals. Everything I sacrificed to protect this knowledge from Stalin's regime, and now that regime is gone. Was it worth it? Did my choice matter at all? The final personal entry was dated December 1997. I'm dying. Not from age, though I'm 92 and should have died years ago, from loneliness, from isolation, from the weight of carrying this secret alone for over 50 years. My body is that of a man in his 70s, but my mind has endured nearly a century of consciousness. I'm tired, so desperately tired. To whoever finds this, I made my choice, knowing the cost. I don't regret protecting this knowledge from those who would abuse it. But I hope you're wiser than we were. I hope humanity has learned something in the decades since I disappeared. Use what I've discovered carefully, or don't use it at all. Some knowledge carries too high a price. Richter closed the journal with trembling hands. Around her, the research team stood in silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. What do we do now? Alexei finally asked. Do we publish? Do we report this to the government? Petrov's expression was grim. We're standing in a bunker that contains research proving we can slow human aging. Do you understand what would happen if this became public? Every government, every military, every corporation with enough resources would descend on this forest. They'd tear it apart looking for the mechanism. People would die, many people. So we destroy it? One of the engineers suggested. Burn the documents, collapse the bunker, pretend we never found anything? We can't, Richter said quietly. Volkov preserved this knowledge for a reason. He believed someday humanity might be ready for it. Destroying it would make his sacrifice meaningless. She looked around at the faces of her team, saw the same conflict she felt reflected in their eyes. This was Volkov's dilemma, passed forward through decades, landing squarely in their laps. "We document everything," she decided. "We catalog every piece of research, preserve it digitally and physically. Then we seal this bunker again, properly this time. We publish a paper about Volkov's disappearance, his death, the basic facts of what we found. But the temporal research, the aging effects, the detailed measurements, those stay classified." "Until when?" Alexei asked. Richter had no answer. Until humanity proved it could handle such power responsibly? Until governments could be trusted not to weaponize it? Until the risk of abuse was somehow eliminated? All of those conditions seemed impossibly distant. The team worked for another week, creating redundant copies of everything. Digital files stored in secure servers across multiple countries, physical copies sealed in climate-controlled containers. A complete record of Dmitry Volkov's life's work, preserved but hidden. They found one more thing before they left. In a corner of the main chamber, carved into the concrete with what must have been years of patient effort, was a message in Russian. Petrov translated it for the team. "Knowledge without wisdom is a loaded gun. I've hidden the gun. Don't pull the trigger until you're certain of the target." On their final day at the site, Dr. Richter stood alone in the bunker. The rest of the team was above ground, preparing for the journey back to civilization. She'd wanted a moment alone with Volkov's ghost, with the weight of the decision she'd just made. Was she right to hide this? Was she qualified to make that choice for all of humanity? Or was she just repeating Volkov's mistake, deciding alone what others should or shouldn't know? She didn't have answers. Nobody did. That was the terrifying truth about knowledge like this. There were no right choices, only consequences you had to live with. As she climbed the stairs for the last time, Richter made a silent promise to the man who died alone in the darkness below. She would protect his secret. She would guard it carefully, share it only when the time was right. If that time ever came. The bunker was sealed with concrete and rebar, then covered with soil and debris. Within months, the forest would reclaim the site completely. On paper, it would be recorded as a minor archaeological find. An old Soviet facility, nothing remarkable, already catalogued and archived. The truth would remain buried, waiting. Dr. Richter returned to her university position, but something fundamental had shifted. She'd lecture on archaeological methodology, discuss proper excavation techniques, review grant proposals, normal academic work. Yet every interaction felt different now, tinged with the knowledge of what she carried. 3 months after sealing the bunker, she received an email from Alexei. Subject line, "You need to see this." Attached was a news article from a Russian science journal. A team of physicists in Moscow had published preliminary findings about localized temporal anomalies. Their research was crude, nowhere near Volkov's sophistication, but the basic concepts were there. Someone else was chasing the same ghost. Richter's hands trembled as she read. This was inevitable, she realized. Volkov hadn't discovered something unique to him alone. He'd found a reproducible phenomenon. Eventually, others would stumble onto the same path. The question wasn't whether the secret would emerge, but when. She made a decision that night. If knowledge like this was going to surface regardless, better it come from someone who understood the dangers. Better it be released carefully, deliberately, with context and warnings attached. Over the next 2 years, Richter became an advocate for what she called responsible temporal research disclosure. She published papers that hinted at possibilities without revealing specifics. She gave lectures about the ethical implications of breakthrough discoveries. She built a network of physicists, ethicists, and policymakers who could form a framework for handling such knowledge. None of them knew she'd already found what they were theorizing about. The full story emerged slowly, piece by carefully measured piece. First came a paper about Volkov's disappearance, focusing on his psychological state and the pressures he faced. Then a follow-up discussing the theoretical work found in his notes, presented as interesting but unverified speculation. Then another, years later, revealing some of the experimental data, framed as historical curiosity rather than actionable science. Each release was calculated. Each piece of information was accompanied by extensive discussion of implications, dangers, and ethical considerations. Richter was building a conversation before revealing the conclusion. In 2031, 15 years after finding the bunker, she published the complete account, every detail of Volkov's research, his facility, his final years, the temporal effects, the aging anomalies, the precise measurements, everything. The response was immediate and massive. Within hours, her university's servers crashed from traffic. News organizations worldwide picked up the story. Scientists demanded access to the original data. Governments issued statements ranging from fascination to condemnation. But something unexpected happened. Because Richter had spent years building the ethical framework first, the conversation didn't immediately jump to applications. Instead, there were debates about responsibility, discussions about oversight, proposals for international agreements on temporal research. The knowledge was out, but it was surrounded by context, warnings, guardrails. Of course, not everyone respected those boundaries. Within months, 3 separate black market operations claimed to offer temporal manipulation services. All were fraudulent, preying on desperate people seeking impossible solutions, but the attempts proved Richter's fears weren't paranoid fantasies. Given the chance, people would absolutely weaponize this. Then came the real test. A team in Beijing announced they'd successfully replicated Volkov's basic effect. They'd created a small chamber where time moved measurably faster than the surrounding environment. Nothing dramatic, just fractions of a second over hours, but it was proof of concept. The Chinese government immediately classified the research. That should have been the end of public access. But the lead scientist, Dr. Wei Chen, made a choice that mirrored Volkov's decades earlier. She leaked the complete methodology online before the classification could take full effect. Her stated reason: this knowledge belongs to humanity, not to governments who will only use it for advantage over each other. Within days, she disappeared. Whether she fled, was detained, or met some other fate remained unclear. But her data spread across the internet like wildfire, impossible to contain. Now everyone had access. Universities, corporations, governments, even well-funded hobbyists. The secret Volkov died protecting was fully, irrevocably public. Richter watched this unfold with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated in her approach. By releasing information gradually with ethical frameworks attached, she'd at least tried to guide responsible development. But another part wondered if she should have kept the secret buried. Maybe Volkov had been right. Maybe some knowledge was too dangerous. The practical applications emerged faster than anyone predicted. A Japanese company developed temporal refrigeration using localized time dilation to preserve food indefinitely. A European pharmaceutical firm created accelerated drug testing chambers, compressing years of trials into months. A startup in California offered time expansion therapy for terminally ill patients, letting them experience subjectively longer lives in their final days. Not all applications were benign. Intelligence agencies explored interrogation chambers where hours of questioning could occur in subjectively much longer periods. Military researchers investigated temporal shielding for weapons systems. The predicted weaponization was happening, just more subtly than anyone expected. Through it all, Richter kept returning to Volkov's final message, carved into concrete. Knowledge without wisdom is a loaded gun. She'd released that knowledge into a world still struggling with wisdom. The gun was now in countless hands. Yet she also saw something Volkov might not have anticipated. The very openness that made the knowledge dangerous also enabled unprecedented collaboration. Research teams across borders shared findings, challenged each other's conclusions, identified dangers collectively. The distributed nature of modern science created a kind of immune response to the worst potential abuses. When a research group in Argentina announced plans for human temporal acceleration trials without proper safety protocols, the global scientific community shut them down within weeks. Not through government intervention, but through coordinated refusal to share necessary supporting research. The scientists themselves became the guardrails. In 2034, an international treaty was signed regulating temporal research. It wasn't perfect, and several major nations refused to participate, but it represented something new. A framework created by scientists for scientists focused on responsible development rather than restriction or exploitation. Richter was invited to speak at the signing ceremony. She declined. This wasn't her victory to celebrate. This was humanity, slowly, imperfectly learning to handle knowledge it wasn't quite ready for. The process was messy and dangerous and would likely claim lives before proper safeguards emerged. But it was happening. She thought often about Volkov in those final months alone in his bunker. The isolation must have been crushing. The weight of his secret, the impossibility of his choice. He'd tried to protect humanity from itself by bearing that burden alone. Maybe he'd been right that the knowledge was dangerous, but he'd been wrong about the solution. Hiding it, dying with it, burying it in concrete. That only delayed the inevitable. Knowledge always emerges. The question is whether it emerges in darkness or light, whether it's hoarded by the few or shared among the many, whether it's surrounded by wisdom or unleashed without context. Volkov had chosen darkness. Richter had chosen light. Neither choice was perfect. Both carried costs. On the 20th anniversary of finding the bunker, Richter returned to the site. The forest had completely reclaimed it, just as she'd predicted. No visible trace remained of what lay beneath. But she knew it was there. The original chamber where Volkov had lived and died, now sealed forever. She stood there alone, thinking about secrets and choices, about knowledge and responsibility, about the impossible decisions people make when facing questions with no right answers. The temporal research would continue. Some of it would help people, some would cause harm, most would fall somewhere in between, like all human knowledge throughout history. Fire burned and cooked. Splitting atoms powered cities and destroyed them. Every breakthrough carried both promise and peril. That was the real lesson Volkov's story taught. Not that knowledge should be hidden or that it should be freely shared, but that the relationship between discovery and wisdom would always be complicated, always uncertain, always requiring judgment calls by imperfect people in impossible situations. She left without marking the site. Some secrets could stay buried. The bunker itself, Volkov's final resting place, the physical evidence of his decades of isolation, those could remain undisturbed. But the knowledge, the research, the truth, that belonged to everyone now. For better or worse, humanity would have to figure out what to do with it together. Walking back through the forest that day, Richter understood something Volkov probably never realized in his isolation. His sacrifice hadn't been meaningless, but neither had it been necessary. The choice wasn't between hiding knowledge and unleashing chaos. The real choice was about trust. Trust that humanity, given enough context and time, could learn to handle even dangerous discoveries responsibly. Would everyone use temporal research wisely? Of course not. Would people die because of misuse? Almost certainly. But they'd also live because of proper use. They'd benefit from medical advances, agricultural improvements, and technologies not yet imagined. Volkov had seen only the danger because he'd lived through Stalin's regime, where power meant death and knowledge meant control. He couldn't imagine a world where scientists shared findings openly, where ethical frameworks emerged through collaboration, where the worst impulses could be checked by transparency rather than secrecy. But that world existed now, imperfect and fragile as it was. The bunker beneath the forest floor stood as testament to both the courage of isolation and its ultimate futility. Some secrets are too important to die with one person, no matter how noble their intentions. The trees around her swayed in the wind, centuries old, still keeping their own mysteries. Not everything needed to be discovered. Not every question required an answer. But once knowledge emerged, once the secret was out, the only path forward was together. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.